Yes.
Okay. Hi. Welcome. I think we'll get started. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Sydney Blackwell, and I'm a member of the Friends of Pine Hawk. You might all know this, but I'm going to give a little history of Pine Hawk just in case. In that we work to bring programs of historical, Native American, and archaeological interest to the community, and have been doing this since 2002. So that's over 120 programs. And what happened in the late 90s, there was a Pine Hawk, where the Pine Hawk name comes from, an archaeological site in South Acton when they were building the sewer treatment plant. And it's in a lovely location along the Assabet River, and they were required to do an archaeological survey that the Public Archaeology Lab in Pawtucket, laboratory in Pawtucket did, commonly known as PAL. And they found some evidence of Native American sites, did further excavation, and found artifacts, thousands of artifacts that can date some of the use back 7,000 years. So, and they did a fabulous report about it, but it was kind of like people would say, well, what was happening? You know, what's happening about that site? And a few people in town, educators, town administrators, citizens. Oh, okay.
Sure.
Let's see. Mute. Video?
Yeah,
It's coming through.
It says the mic is on. So.
You know, this is the library. This is the library Zoom. Okay. All right. So if I'm not muted, I'll just keep talking. And so some people brought this slide. Well, we really need to bring this information to the town. Gave a public program, and that was the beginning of Pine Hawk. Pine Hawk also was part of helping get the archaeological bylaw 3 years ago. So that's kind of what we do. And we are extremely grateful to the library and to Freedom's Way, who help support our programs. We're also lucky that that PAL connection has continued, and we have Holly Herbster, who is a senior archaeologist and principal investigator at PAL. You've been there 30 years? A long time.
More than 30 years.
More than 30 years. Yeah. Okay. I've heard say that if you want someone to remember what you say it right in the beginning. So when I was thinking about what did I want to say about Holly, it was this, and I'll read it because, you know, I'll probably screw it up. But through 30 years in archaeology, let's see, through 30 years in archaeology, with a commitment to collaboration, Holly has brought heart and soul to her work, which I believe to be extremely true. Thank you. But go back a little bit to the beginning. Holly earned a BA from Kenyon College in anthropology and an MA in historical archaeology at the University of UMass Boston. But if you had been in her second grade class, she might have given you an arrowhead from her grandfather's collection. So it starts way back. Holly has directed more than 300 cultural resource management archaeological projects. She's co-author of the Historical Archaeology and Indigenous Collaboration, Discovering Histories That Have Futures, that won the Society of American Archaeology Scholarly Book Award in 2021. She has a new book that coming out in February that she'll talk about, Historical Archaeology of Massachusetts, hence the topic today. So for an overview of Massachusetts post-1600 archaeological heritage, please help me welcome Holly Herbster.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate that as well. I am going to talk to you tonight about a book project that has been 4 very long years in the making, because it's been sort of an after-work part-time project of mine that I have been working on with Joe Bagley, who is the Boston City archaeologist. We were asked to work on a manuscript that's part of a series that the University Press of Florida is publishing on topical and regional archaeology. This is going to be the first book. It's going to be coming out in February. So this is going to be the first look at archaeology in New England, and specifically we were asked to focus on what is commonly referred to as the historic period. So I'm going to go back a little bit further in time. By historical archaeology, I'm not limiting us to just what happened after the Europeans came here. So we're going to talk a lot about indigenous archaeology and about other communities besides white settler colonies. And I'm going to try and give you an overview of some of the more interesting, different, diverse sites that we have found in our research. We looked at over 500 books, reports, websites, manuscripts. There's a lot going on in Massachusetts in terms of archaeology. So we picked some of those to talk about in our book, and then I'm going to pull a subset of those out to talk with you about today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any one site. I'm used to speaking about one particular archaeological site and spending all my time talking about that. So I'm going to pick and choose. I'm going to give you a little, just enough to whet your appetite. Most of the sites that I'm going to talk about today, you can find information about them either on public websites or publicly available reports. And I'm happy, I'll leave plenty of time for questions afterwards. So if you have a question about a particular site that you'd like to know more about, I can let you know where you might be able to find some more information about that. So on we go. This is a map showing all of the recorded historic period archaeological sites in Massachusetts. It's maintained by the State Archaeologist's Office at the Massachusetts Historical Commission. This is confidential information. The locations of archaeological sites in Massachusetts, as they are in most parts of the country, are kept confidential primarily to protect those sites from people who would want to go out and harm them. And obviously, looking at a map at this scale, these X's, you wouldn't be able to navigate anywhere anyway. But if you're a professional archaeologist like me, this is a database that you can go into, and I can zoom in and I can see the name and the specific information about the site. But this gives you just a kind of an overview of how many historic period archaeological sites have been recorded in Massachusetts. There's nearly 6,000 of them. They go back in time to the 1500s all the way up to the 20th century. And before long, I've actually heard that there are potentially going to be some late 20th century sites that are going to be included as archaeological resources before long. According to the federal legislation that we work under, if something is at least 50 years old, it can be considered as an eligible site to the National Register of Historic Places. That doesn't mean automatically, but we're at a threshold where 50 years ago is enough to bump something up to that designation. When you look at this map, you can kind of see that there are areas where there are concentrations of sites and there are gaps. The vast majority of these sites have been recorded by cultural resource management archaeologists. So people who do the type of archaeology that I do at the Public Archaeology Lab, which I'll call PAL going forward. So these are places where there has been some requirement to do archaeological work. So they're focused in areas where there's development primarily, right? So you can see some corridors here. For example, there's this dense bit, I don't have a pointer, but there's this dense bit of site here in the Quabbin Reservoir area. That was because there was documentation of historic homesteads before the reservoir was created. You can also see some patterning along corridors. So Route 495, that was all archaeologically surveyed. Route 146 in Massachusetts, there's a line of sites you see there. And again, these are just the post-contact period sites. If we added to this the ancient Native American sites, you would see a lot more, but you would see these same patterns. So the areas in central and western Massachusetts where there's been less modern period development, less infrastructure, you tend to see less archaeological sites. That doesn't mean they're not there. That just means they haven't been recorded with as much detail. There's also a lot of emphasis along the Connecticut River because there's been a lot more development there. That was also a focal point for really early historic habitation. So the shoreline, the Cape, the islands, the Connecticut River Valley, those were the earliest places that were settled. So there's a higher density of sites because people were living in that area for a longer period from the 16th century on. So this is the starting point that we worked from as we put together this information. A lot of the research that we've tried to include in the book and that I'll be talking about today comes from work that I do, which is traditionally included in reports that we consider to be gray literature. So not reports that are easily accessible to the public because They're either done for a private property owner who doesn't have to make that information public. They're done for an agency, and the report is a compliance type document, but doesn't go out into the general public. So what we've tried to do with our book project and what I'm going to talk about tonight is a blending of sites that we can share information about, that you can either go and visit or you can read more about, and those that maybe have flown under the radar that not as many people know about. When we look at the distribution of the age of these sites, right, we're going to talk about primarily the 16th century as our starting point here. And we're going to go all the way up into, the end of the 20th century. And you can see right away, there's this huge spike in the 19th century. So of those sites that we know when they date to, we have a lot of sites where we don't have enough diagnostic information to be able to place them within a particular century, a particular time period. Those that date to the 19th century, if you think about the historical trajectory of Massachusetts, it kind of makes sense. The 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution. So we have this explosion of industrial sites, water-powered resources, factories, and then we have this huge influx of immigrants into Massachusetts during that same period of the 19th century. And sort of the explosion of the development and the expansion of towns and communities. So a lot of the reason that we see this spike is directly related to sort of the ebb and flow of the historical development of Massachusetts. So it's kind of interesting, and I think it's also pretty cool that given the randomness of doing archaeological investigation and survey, that we see the same pattern in sites as we do in sort of how the population of Massachusetts has grown. And then, going into the 20th century, we have a little bit less that's preserved, or in some cases, a little bit less that has been investigated by archaeologists because it's a little bit more recent. You can see we have some sites that date to the 21st century that have been recorded. Those are primarily sites that have to do with either descendant community activities or something maybe that's a site that's been identified as a commemorative location where activities happened. So this is kind of the broad overview of Massachusetts archaeology on the statewide scale. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how we got to how historical archaeology developed in Massachusetts, because it's really emblematic of the development of the discipline across the country. So Massachusetts had some of the earliest archaeological investigations that were conducted in the United States. Now, obviously, we have some of the oldest sites on the East Coast, right? There's older sites in Florida. There's some older sites in sort of the Tidewater and, the southern colonies area. But Massachusetts in particular, I think because of the allure of the Pilgrims and the sort of historical desire to commemorate that sort of founding of the United States and Massachusetts. There were efforts as early as the 1850s to start documenting historical sites from the Pilgrim era. So one of the first of these was Pilgrim Hall, which was built in 1824 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And according to my research, somebody will probably find a way to contest this, but Pilgrim Hall Museum is reportedly the oldest public museum in the United States. That's still in operation, that's still standing. So 1824, so think about that. That's less than 50 years after the American Revolution, and we've already got a museum now built to commemorate, the Pilgrims here. One of the earliest studies that's been documented, or two of the earliest studies, are at the Uptuxet Trading Post, or the supposed location of the Uptuxet Trading Post, which is in Bourne, right on the Cape Cod Canal. There's still a building there. There's a museum at the Uptuxet Trading Post that's more or less at the location where this dig was conducted in the 1850s. At that point, you can see from the slides, these are kind of bad photographs, but this was sort of blowing open a large area and looking for foundations. This is what kind of characterized the earliest efforts. At this point in time, there was no profession of archaeology per se. And those people who were academic archaeologists in the early part of the 19th century were primarily interested in ancient Native American sites. So, and many of them were not particularly interested in Massachusetts. So the earliest archaeologists at Harvard, for example, did most of their work in Central America, the Southwest, the area of the Mississippi Delta. So people were not as interested at that point. There were a few people here and there, but they weren't as interested in the ancient history in Massachusetts, those people who were doing academic archaeology. And it really wasn't even at that point a discipline. So John Batchelder was, as were most of the early sort of avocationalists, a gentleman who was, I believe, a doctor. If you think about the people who wrote most of Massachusetts town histories, your town history was probably written, I'm going to guess, I might be wrong, by a medical doctor who was an older white man who in his spare time decided to write a history of his community and just, tell the story from time immemorial going forward. That's a pattern that I've seen across Massachusetts. It doesn't mean the history wasn't good, that it wasn't well researched, but archaeology per se was a wealthy gentleman's pursuit in these days. So John Batchelder did some digging around at the supposed location of Eptuxet using the documents that he had available to him. Now, at this point in time, the Cape Cod Canal, as we know it, didn't exist. There was some preliminary work to create it, but at that point it was still two rivers that kind of came together and didn't quite meet in a river valley. So John found some foundation ruins and he started to dig around. He found some artifacts that more or less fit the time period of the 17th century and decided based on all of that this was the location of a trading post that had been built by the Pilgrims to trade with Native Americans and also to trade with the Dutch who were coming up from New York. So the idea being that because it's located, near Buzzards Bay, near the open ocean, that the Dutch could come up from New York, the Indians could come from wherever they were, and all three groups could trade with each other. So the plan that he drew, however, is really more reminiscent of a later 17th century or possibly even early 18th century house. So this site, like many of the others that were investigated in the earlier days of sort of this burgeoning field of historical archaeology, has been reinvestigated at least 3 times since that period, most recently in the 1980s and 90s. Some of that work has included re-excavation at the original site that Batchelder excavated, and some of it is just reanalyzing artifacts that were collected at that time. So despite the fact that there was, according to all documentation, some type of trading post, some type of structure located along the canal in Bourne, most archaeologists today believe that this site was actually probably an early settler home site as opposed to a trading post. It may have also functioned that way, but it likely does not date to that very early Pilgrim period. It's likely that whatever structure was there probably was very temporary. It wasn't a place where people were living, and that there probably is no evidence of it left today. Another study that happened in those early years, right around the same time, it was 1852 at Eptuxet, 1856, a gentleman named James Hall began to look for the site of Miles Standish in Duxbury, the home site of Miles Standish in Duxbury. He had he had better documentation because this was actually an established location of a home. And because it was Miles Standish's house, this is something that we find a lot when we do historical archaeology of important figures, is that there's a lot of documentation and that site gets remembered over time, right? So from the time that Miles Standish was living there in the 1620s, 30s, 40s, people who settled in that area afterwards had always remembered there had been this maintained memory of this general location where the house was. So it wasn't a forgotten place and it was not developed. That's another important thing because it was people knew, oh, it's over there. There weren't houses that got built like many of the early 17th century sites that probably existed here in Massachusetts were either expanded and built over. So you picture your old Cape Cod home that maybe started out as 2 or 3 rooms with a small base, and then it's over time gets expanded, added onto, instead of a small partial cellar, a full cellar gets dug out. You have all your utilities going. So there's little evidence of that original house left. This was a location where the site was pretty well preserved. So Hall actually, and you can see this veneration, that top right picture. You probably can't read it from here, but it's got a label on it. It says, "This stone was from Miles Standish's house found on this spot." And it's, got this label that's been preserved over time. It's a very venerated artifact. So James Hall actually did a plan scale drawing of the foundation remains that he discovered and identified, which you can see here. So there was a house and then an attached building, maybe a barn or something like that attached to the house. When archaeologists went back to this site in the more recent past, they discovered that these plans are incredibly accurate. He used scale drawings. He also, at a time when this was not something that people thought to do, he recorded where the objects that he pulled from the site came from. He plotted them on his site plans. And so going back to this place today, archaeologists can use this information. And in some ways, this site has been referred to, and James Hall's work in the 1850s has been kind of identified as maybe the beginnings of historical archaeology in Massachusetts. So this work has more or less stood the test of time. Some of his interpretations are a little bit off because we've done so much work now and we've done more research, but in general, that work has really stood the test of time. And this is an early example of what would later become a professional academic pursuit. So around the same time, the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, the MAS, was founded. Today, it is, as it was then, a sort of collaborative group of avocationalists, people who are interested in history and archaeology, and academic, at that time academic, now academic and professional archaeologists. So the MAS was started in 1939, actually at Phillips Andover Academy. And while that group focused in that period of time primarily on ancient Native American sites, and that was something that they were really mostly interested in, early on, there were a few studies that they did, again, at colonial/Pilgrim era sites, because that was really all that people at that point in time were interested in. And so the earliest example of a historic site report that I could find in the bulletin that they started publishing from the beginning dates to 1949, and it's a study of some supposed Pilgrim house sites. So again, mostly focused on the ancient past, but another early site is one of the site of a freed Black woman who lived in Andover that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But that was also a site that was investigated as part of the early efforts of the Mass Archaeological Society. So we move forward in time. There's little bits of research here and there, digging at some sites. And the next kind of big jump in what we would refer to as historical archaeology here comes in around the 1940s. And there were two really big sites that kind of led to, or two big projects that sort of led to the development of historical archaeology in Massachusetts. First and foremost is the work of Roland Robbins. Roland Robbins did not graduate from high school. He was born in 1908. So in the 40s, he's, in his 30s. He'd never graduated from high school. He was a house painter, a handyman. He had a lot of different jobs in Massachusetts over time, but he became very interested in history, in Massachusetts history. And in 1945, on the 100th anniversary of Thoreau's move to Walden Pond to build his cabin there, Robbins decided that he was going to go out and try and find the location. He did, or he found evidence of the cabin. He did some limited digging around that area. It wasn't a very substantial structure. And then, importantly, he reconstructed the building. So he used his skills as a handyman and a carpenter to go through Thoreau's writings. So he did a lot of research on the thorough documentation that Thoreau had done. For those of you who have read him, he was a very careful man in his notes and in his writings. So Roland Robbins used that information combined with going out and looking at the land, sort of following along to rebuild the cabin. And that was really a step forward. This is something that today every archaeologist would do. You would start with your historical background. You would look for information about the location. You would do a site survey, and then you would go from there. He started giving lectures. Over time, he published 4 books. He excavated more than 60 sites, and he gave more than 700 lectures. So he was a man who became very committed to historical archaeology, even though he had no professional training, and there really wasn't a profession in historical archaeology at that time. In 1948, he was approached by I think they were called the First Ironworks Association in Saugus, which was a group of wealthy ironworks owners and people with deep pockets. And they decided they had purchased the location in Saugus where the first ironworks in the United States was founded, at Saugus, by John Winthrop in the 1630s. So this is probably the premier and oldest industrial site that we have certainly in the Northeast and possibly even in the whole United States. Like the site of the trading post and Miles Standish's house, this location had not been redeveloped or developed over time. And there were some sort of ruins. There were some monumental structures that had been built on this site as part of a massive ironworks enterprise. So Robbins was hired based on his sort of self-promotion to come and be the director to identify the full this ironworks site along the Saugus River, and then importantly, to help with its reconstruction. So the Ironworks Company wanted to highlight, the history of ironworking in America and make this a signature site that people could come and visit. So Robbins got involved, and he did some things that had up to this point not been done before. So number one, he brought in heavy equipment. He brought in steam shovels. He brought in a lot of laborers, and he started to move a lot of soil. So in some places, this site was buried under 5-10 feet of slag, of the byproduct of ironworking, of soil that had been deposited. So he went at it, not with a trowel or a toothbrush, but with a steam shovel. So this was pretty revolutionary. He opened up a vast area of several acres on the site. He also, just based on his own sort of knowledge and interest, decided to incorporate specialized people into this study. So he brought in professional land surveyors. He brought in engineers. He brought in some people to do conservation of the iron artifacts that he was finding, which at that point were, I think, chemists. They certainly weren't, there was no archaeology conservation at that time. So they were probably chemists or people who were used to working. Maybe they were even people associated with the ironworks who did this. And so he embarked on this years-long project at the Saugus Ironworks. So some of you have probably been to there, maybe many of you have. So that site that you see today, that's part of the National Park Service's property, most of the reconstruction that was done there, including the giant stone blast furnace that was built there, that's what this picture on the upper right is. This is Robbins excavating the blast furnace, and it looks like a construction site. He's got staging, he's got this huge area opened up. So this was pretty revolutionary at the time. And again, even though he did not have any training, he employed the techniques that today are standard for people who do industrial archaeology. They've been refined a little bit. Certainly he wasn't perfect, and he let a lot of things go. And he was mostly focused on the actual work. So he was looking at structural elements. When there were some really cool and interesting artifacts that came up, like this hammerhead that dates to the early part of the 17th century, this decorated hammerhead, those things were collected and put on display, but he was more focused on sort of the site, the footprint of the site and the structures. Now, at this time, we're in the 1940s, going into the 1950s. Now we have archaeology developing as a discipline. And academics at this time, the academic archaeologists, derided Roland Robbins. They did not invite him to attend any of their conferences. They publicly stated that his work was not good, that he wasn't doing things in a professional way, that he wasn't recording things properly. And from what I have been able to read about him, because several archaeologists have written extensive biographies about him and his influence on the development of the field. Now he's recognized as a pioneer in the field, but when he was alive, apparently it always was something that really upset him, that he was not accepted by the archaeological community. So I wanted to make sure I spent a little bit of time with Roland Robbins today to give him his due, because he really was a pioneer in the field, and we recognize that today. So shifting from Saugus, we go over to Plymouth Plantation, and here we have the start of really what became a full-fledged reconstruction archaeology, where you're doing archaeology in order to get information to build back up a site. So Plymouth Plantation was actually started in 1957. That was when the first buildings went up. There were buildings originally down at the harbor where the Mayflower 2 is parked now. There were a couple of reconstructed pilgrim houses there for a short period of time. But the village where it is now was built on property that was owned by the Hornblower family. So Harry Hornblower was a very wealthy member of the Hornblower family who had made their money in finances. And the property where Plymouth Plantation is today was one of their estates. It was one of their 2 summer estates. Harry Hornblower had become really interested in archaeology as a kid because his gardener in Plymouth was one of the founding members of the MAS and was a huge avocational collector. His name was Jesse Brewer, and he's pretty legendary in the annals of the Mass Archaeological Society because he had a huge collection of artifacts. And he got Harry and his brother Ralph very interested in archaeology at a young age. Harry went to Harvard. He studied archaeology while he was there with, at that time, a graduate student named James Dietz, who went on to become pretty much the preeminent historical archaeologist in Massachusetts. So he got to know Dietz, got it in his head that, you know, they needed to do this reconstruction of the Pilgrim Village, not in its original location. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And so this is one of my all-time favorite photographs. This is Harry on the, what do we call that? I don't even know the name of that machine anymore. Steam shovel, excavator with, you know, waving to the pilgrims. This was one of the promotional materials for when the village opened up at first. And then here we have they look the same today, but this is one of the early efforts to, to build what was one of the pilgrim houses, using information from those few archaeological sites like Miles Standish's house that had been excavated up to that point. And then this image in the middle top is basically, this is a photo showing all of the items that would go into a typical pilgrim home. And those are taken from research in inventories, in probate inventories. So this type of archaeology was not really about the people, it was about the place and the things, right? So it was about reconstructing what a town or a house or a place, a fort looked like, and then filling it with the objects that would have been there. There really wasn't, in the early days of Plymouth Plantation, there wasn't that emphasis on the individuals that now is such an important part of that museum. So then we jump ahead a little bit more and we go to archaeology as a profession. So we've moved beyond academic archaeology, and now we jump into the time in 1966 with the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act, which required state and federal agencies to consider the impacts of their actions on archaeological sites and historic resources. We suddenly have this need for hundreds, thousands of archaeologists to start to comply with this new legislation. 1966 is also when state historic preservation offices were created under that same legislation. So that's when Massachusetts gets its first state archaeologist. And there's suddenly a need to do all kinds of work going forward. So some of the early studies were done by the National Park Service. Federal agencies also had a requirement to do archaeology on the lands that they manage. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Park Service commissioned work at places like the Great Tavern, or also called Smith's Tavern in Wellfleet, which is this image up here. And this is at the time, you know, today we would use our computer technology, but back then this is a reconstruction of what this tavern looked like in Wellfleet. They also did more work at Saugus, so they're going back now to a site in Saugus. They worked at the Salem Maritime National Historic Park, and they did some work at Lowell as well, and at Minuteman, importantly. We'll talk about Minuteman in a little bit. Some of the early studies, I mentioned to you those corridors where you see a lot of sites. This is a slide from the 1970s. This is doing work before 495 is being built from 95 down towards the Cape. This is actually the first project that the Public Archaeology Lab did when it was part of Brown. So when this legislation was passed and we suddenly needed all these archaeologists to do this work, the first groups to do it were academic departments within universities. So in Massachusetts, you had Harvard, you had Boston University, you had Brown in Rhode Island, but Brown was one of the schools that did it. And they were the first to kind of train their students and then have their students go out and do these projects. So another one that was a big project, slightly later, but not too much later, was Boston's Big Dig, which everybody knows about. This project was primarily identifying historic period archaeological sites, going back to John Winthrop's Great House, which was in Charlestown Square. That's this image over here. First governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, right there in the middle of what's today Charlestown. And later that became a tavern. So you have a 17th century component, an 18th century component, a 19th century component. There were potteries that were identified along the waterfront. There were individual houses. There's just so much information available about the Big Dig. This booklet that I have up here, Highway to the Past, if you're interested, that's something you can easily get online. And the Boston City Archaeologist Office has a lot of online information. Because the Big Dig was such a huge project, there was a lot of public education that went into it. So this predated me just by a few years, but I know from the work that Pal did on this project, they had multiple days where the public was invited to come out. They had interpreters on site. There was, for all of the headache of the construction project, the powers that be were trying to get as much positive as they could out of it. So the archaeology became something that really drew people to it. Okay. So I went a little bit longer in the background. Now we're going to just talk about sites, but I wanted to set the stage for Massachusetts and how we really have been on the cutting edge for the development of archaeology, historical archaeology in particular, and that some of the earliest work that was done in Massachusetts really has set the stage for work that went on in other parts of the country. So I mentioned we don't talk when we're talking about indigenous sites. We are trying to get away from this hard line between pre-contact, contact, post-contact, right? So indigenous people have been here and continue to be here continuously over time. So for our purposes, for doing this book project and for looking for kind of setting a cutoff point for ourselves, we started looking mostly at sites going back to the 16th century, and that was about it. So one of the examples that I can tell you is this site on Sandy's Point in Yarmouth, which was actually identified as part of a PAL project for a housing subdivision. We identified what we thought were potentially mounds from corn hills from an indigenous planting field. And because of the importance of the site, UMass Boston came in with their field school and opened up a much larger area. They were able to spend more time. The development project got shifted so that this site could be preserved. And they documented what is clearly a native planting field that dates, based on the artifacts that were found there, from a period of about 1,000 years ago, going all the way up to the 1600s. So this was a site that was being used by indigenous people before the first European settlers came, after there were permanent colonists living on Cape Cod, and then continuing to be there for some period of time. One of the interesting things about this site is that some of the analysis that they did in these corn hills, they did identify fish bone in the soils. They did very careful soil studies, which is something that especially William Bradford had talked about. A lot of archaeologists had at that point discounted some of the early settler descriptions as being very biased and being seen through European eyes, so not necessarily accurate. And this was part of a study combined with later oral history collection that identified that indigenous people did, of course, use their knowledge of the environment to keep their planting fields fertile. But this was archaeology sort of helping out to add a piece to that story. Another relatively early site is one of several of the so-called praying Indian villages that were established by John Eliot across eastern Massachusetts after the first colonists came, primarily as in an attempt to Christianize and to civilize indigenous people. The site of Magunkaquag is in Ashland, present-day Ashland, Massachusetts. This also started as a cultural resource management project for a housing subdivision. The property owner, once we identified the site of what may have been a common meeting house at that location, that developer was able to set that lot aside. And once again, UMass Boston came in and spent several seasons of field school doing excavation and documentation there, and found some really interesting colonial era materials that go along with and sort of support some of the accounts of how tools and other objects were kept in a common meeting house. And when John Eliot and the other English missionaries would come to visit, this would be a spot where everyone would gather and they would kind of keep common supplies there. So this was a really fascinating site that ended up part of it being protected. Another very interesting project, and this is one that you can definitely read about, is excavations on the Harvard campus in Harvard Yard at the site of the Harvard Indian College. The location of the oldest or the first academic building in, again, I'm saying this is fact, but I can't guarantee you this. The oldest intentionally built college academic building is the Indian College on the Harvard campus. Harvard was created on land that was donated by the settlers who lived there. And so the first students who attended Harvard actually met in houses, met in buildings that were already there. So the Indian College was the first building that was actually constructed for the purpose of education. Now, Harvard had, as part of its mission, from its charter that came from England, the mandate that they were supposed to be educating Native Americans to help with that effort to Christianize them. So it was one of these things where part of the money that came to Harvard was tied to the fact that they were going to educate indigenous scholars. So the college building is built in 1639, but the first indigenous students don't come until the 1660s, late 1660s. And then you have King Philip's War a few years later. The Indian College is essentially just canceled out. So there were no graduates. There were no Harvard graduates in those first few years of the Indian College, although those initial students have been identified as part of the Harvard Yard project. And they've been given, they were all given posthumous degrees by the university. The Harvard Yard Archaeological Project was undertaken by archaeologists at Harvard in collaboration with the Harvard Indigenous Studies and Native American students groups. And they know the exact footprint of where the building was in Harvard Yard. There are pieces of it, of the foundation, that are still there. Subsequent construction got rid of some of them. But they found pieces in the excavation of the original first printing press in New England that was built, that was housed in the Harvard Indian College. And the first book printed in America was done on the press at the Harvard Indian College. And it was a Bible that the missionary John Eliot had printed that had English and Algonquin, was written in English and Algonquin. And it was, again, supposed to be used as a way to Christianize the Indians. But they were able to actually take pieces of the type and go to, I think there are maybe 4 or 5 of these original Bibles that exist. One of them is at the Natick Library. I know Harvard has at least 1 copy. And they were able to actually match the type. So they know, with all of its little, like all the little imperfections in it. So they know that these pieces of type that they found printed that first book in the 1600s. So really pretty incredible. Moving a little bit further into the more recent past, into the 19th century, the other indigenous places that we talk about, and when we think of historical archaeology, are places where indigenous people are, native communities are today, and the archaeology is done with and by indigenous people. So we have a lot of examples of this work in Aquinnah on Martha's Vineyard, where the tribe maintains tribal trust lands, many of which contain foundations and ruins from houses that tribal people lived in the 1800s. They've documented many of those and have preserved most of them. And this is a scale drawing of some work. Pal worked on this project as well with members of the tribe to do documentation and collect oral history about these places. The Stockbridge-Munsee Community Band of Mohicans out in Western Massachusetts, the Stockbridge area. Their Tribal Historic Preservation Office has initiated archaeological work at the site of their 1739 meeting house, which I think is right in the downtown area of Stockbridge. And they've initiated those archaeological investigations to help document that place. And they have also been doing work at a location that's outside of the downtown area that is a known through oral tradition and through historical documents, the site of an ox roast that was a gift from George Washington to tribal members who had participated in the Revolutionary War. So this was a commemorative event. Washington did not attend himself, but he sent some of his top generals, and this ox roast is well documented as having happened at the site of the sachem of the tribe at that time. And so today's Historic Preservation Office is trying to, they know where that parcel of land is, and so they've been doing some archaeological work to try and identify where that event happened and what they can learn from archaeology that maybe wasn't captured in sort of the commemorative, language that was written in the day. And then there's also been a lot of work done on Nipmuc archaeological sites in this part of Massachusetts and in central Massachusetts, being done collaboratively with members of the Nipmuc tribe. A lot of that work done by UMass Boston to identify and document homesteads from tribal members from the 1800s, early 1800s, mid 1800s, and even in the late 1800s. And this has been work that's been done, bringing in a lot of younger tribal members as well to kind of learn more about the history. A lot of the interpretation or all of the interpretation is being done in collaboration with tribal members today. And some of them even know, some of them are old enough to know or have grandparents who remember when some of these foundations actually had standing structures. So it's this really incredible continuity of history. And it's also a wonderful education for the graduate students, archaeology graduate students who are working on this project, because they're learning about the history of the place, not just from the archaeology. So these are just some really good examples of Indigenous sites. Oh, I think I went. No, okay. So we'll go back now to the European sites, some of them. There's very little evidence in Massachusetts of the temporary sites where explorers and fishermen would have stopped. So if you think about your history on Cape Cod, Samuel de Champlain was cruising around Cape Cod, drawing maps of indigenous villages in the 1500s. Bartholomew Gosnold reported on his journey along Cape Cod and out on Cuttyhunk Island, presumably. I think that's what most people have settled on, the island he describes as Cuttyhunk. But really, there hasn't been any good archaeological evidence of those places. Partially, I think, because they were very temporary. They weren't meant to be long lasting. There wasn't time to build these permanent structures. It was just a place where people camped for a couple of weeks, maybe. And then probably more likely, it's because a lot of these places would have been right on the coast in areas that have now either eroded away or have been developed. There's very little of the coastline that hasn't been heavily disturbed, developed, or eroded. So it's really rare to find sites right along the coast. Two sites that do survive from this early period that are incredibly well preserved. The Nickerson site in Chatham on Cape Cod dates to about 1660. So it's not the first era of the pilgrims. It's after the first wave of people have come, and now people are starting to spread out from Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. This was one of the earlier settlements on the Cape. The Nickerson family is, if you're on the Cape and you're in the Chatham area, the Nickerson name is everywhere. And this is another place where the location had been known and preserved. The Nickerson Family Association, so they're a pretty robust group, purchased the land, I don't know, and maybe in the early 20th century. And so the site where the house was thought to be had been preserved. Craig Chartier, who is a professional archaeologist, was invited to come and do some excavation there. And he actually found remarkably that this site is essentially undisturbed. So there's no structural evidence of it. There's nothing above the ground. But in this plan, you can see he found the location of the house, the location of a barn, and really importantly, and really, really rare in New England, he found evidence of a wooden palisade that would have gone around it, which is often described in these early colonial home sites as being a defensive work, but also a way to demarcate indigenous land holdings from colonial land holdings. outside of this palisade, there are a number of Native American features that have in them the sort of traditional indigenous tool types as well as historic period materials. And some work that's been done here suggests that Nickerson may have operated some sort of a trading post or may have had some kind of regular relationship with the tribal folks who were in this area at the time. So that's something that is still being teased out, but this is just an incredibly rare example of a site from this period preserved. And I think there's an article in the Cape Cod Times today, but the site was just determined eligible for listing in the National Register under all 4 of the criteria that you list a site under, which is really unusual. It meets pretty much every indicator. So this site is going to get listed in the National Register. The other one that I just want to mention is the Waterman House site, which is in Marshfield. This site was identified as part of a cultural resource management study because the perimeter fence around the Marshfield airport was being upgraded, and archaeologists had to come and look at it. They just dug small 2-foot by 2-foot holes, which is how we start a survey. But in just a couple of them, they found some 17th century artifacts, and they thought that was really unusual. So they recommended more work. Over time, this entire site area got cleared, and what you can see here is a house site. So this one has not a palisade, but a little wooden area on the outside of the door, probably more to protect just the front door. And this is another site that somehow over time did not get disturbed, did not get destroyed. And this house burned down. The records are really good for the site. It burned down after only a few years, so it was kind of a time capsule. So this was not a site that was redeveloped over time. The family left, and actually the archaeologists, through some of the analysis that they did there, they found burned grape seeds in some of the burned debris around the house site. So they actually think that the fire, we don't know exactly when the fire happened because there aren't records after that period, that because the grape seeds were there, that maybe the house burned down in the fall after grapes had been harvested. So these are the kind of things that today archaeologists are thinking about and looking at. They're looking at how space is utilized. Where are you finding artifacts? How is the internal part of the house organized? Where were people doing different activities? So this is kind of, the way we're looking at things today as opposed to the way that we look. So we're still going back to the pilgrim sites, but we're just looking at them with different questions. The last thing I don't have slides for is the Plymouth 400 project that UMass Boston worked on over the last couple of years on Burial Hill in Plymouth, where they identified what they think are actual components of the original first pilgrim settlement. So it wasn't where Plymouth Plantation is. Everybody has always known that. They always knew it was in what's today downtown Plymouth, but they weren't sure exactly where it was. So Burial Hill is where the old town cemetery is now. And they found evidence there of the palisade that William Bradford talks about and of some structures. They're still in the process of going through analysis, but that's a site that you can find more information about online. There aren't a lot of sites in Massachusetts that demonstrate the lives of enslaved people. So slavery was legal in Massachusetts into the 1700s. It's not something that most people talk about in Massachusetts, but one of the few sites that has been well preserved and documented is the Royal House in Medford. That is operated today as a museum. It is run and operated with a specific focus on what was the slave quarters, which is that smaller building to the right there. That's the emphasis of the museum. So if you haven't been there, I highly encourage you to go and check out this site. It's a really well done exhibit space. They did a lot of work to identify the places where enslaved people did their work, the places where they were exposed to the people who owned the house, and private spaces behind the house. They found very interestingly, very different archaeological deposits in the public spaces where the European colonial owners of the property would have seen them, as opposed to the private spaces in the back. This is also a site. The royal family built this house here in the 1730s. They operated plantations in the Caribbean, so they were part of the triangle trade in the sense that they made their wealth from sugar plantations. The enslaved people that they had on their property in Medford primarily came from Caribbean locations. So they were people who were enslaved and brought to those islands, and then their second place to be brought was up here to Massachusetts. They actually were loyalists, so they vacated their property during the American Revolution and left it behind and went up to Canada. So much of this property is really well preserved. It's an excellent, excellent place to go and visit. The Lucy Foster home site, this is a site that was investigated by archaeologists as part of the Mass Archaeological Society initially in the 1940s. It's in Andover, Massachusetts. It's a small house, a very small house that sits alone in an undeveloped area. Lucy Foster was known in local history because she was a formerly enslaved woman who, when she was freed, went to live by herself sort of out in what was then the hinterland. So she was somewhat of an anomaly and was a person who was talked about in town histories. The original archaeology that was done there found a lot of tea wares. This is an example of some tea service, so a saucer and a teacup on her property. And so their initial thought was, oh, she must have operated a tavern, because as a single woman and a woman of relatively little means, she wouldn't have had an elaborate tea service. More recent investigation at this site has, and the collection of more oral history, has determined that probably her house was actually a community gathering space for other people. She was an Afro-Indigenous person, as many people in Massachusetts were during that period, and that her home probably served as a community focal point for other people who were members of descendant Afro and Indigenous communities, and that rather than operating a tavern, she probably welcomed people into her home. This is something that has been seen at many of the Nipmuc sites as well. Many of the women, especially if they lived alone, if they were widowed or they were unmarried older women, they became sort of community supporters, and people would often gather at their homes. So now archaeologists think that that's what happened at Lucy Foster's home site. Parting Ways is a site in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It's right on the Plymouth-Kingston town line. It's a place where 4 primarily African, but also Afro-Indigenous families settled after the Revolutionary War. And again, this is in a location that's well away from town. So they're being sort of pushed out of the more Eurocentric part of town, and they're living in what is considered to be a more marginal location. These 4 families each built a house in sort of a quadrangle, if you will, with some common space in the middle. And all 4 of these home foundations are still there. So again, it's a really rare example of a small community, a small gathered community where the home sites are still there. Again, this is a site that people have gone back to over time. There were some tamarind jars that were found at one of these properties that the early archaeologists thought were representative of traditional African, either ritual or food preparation. And so the idea with the initial excavation and interpretation of this site was that it was people who were either from Africa or who were directly descended from African slaves, and that they were perpetuating their African belief systems as they, move from one generation to the next, which is probably something that did happen. But more importantly for this site, the home site where these jars came from belonged to a man who was a mariner, as many Afro-Indigenous men were at this point in time, who traveled the world as part of his work. So if you think about the whalers, the merchants, these were men from Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities who were more well-traveled and more worldly than 99% of the white people living in New England at the time. And oftentimes you notice in their home sites, this happens a lot in Maquina, where many of the men went around the world as whalers. They have artifacts, they have objects that they brought back with them in their travels that are considered relatively rare and would be in a European or a Euro-American household. They would be considered to be really expensive, like amazing items. And these were things that they brought back with them. So another example of just, sort of reanalysis, reexamination, thinking about sort of archaeological sites in another way at another point in time. And then the last site I want to talk about is the African Meeting House on Beacon Hill in Boston, built in 1805. It's a National Historic Landmark. It is the oldest extant African-American meeting house in the country. Adjacent to it is the Abiel Smith School, which was built in 1835. That is the oldest extant school building that was built, constructed, used only by African-American children. They're right next to each other. Beacon Hill was the focus of a very prominent and vibrant Black community in the 1800s. And the African Meeting House is a good example of this. Some of the earliest excavations here were done by the Museum of African American History, who purchased the building, the Smith School and the museum, and today operated as a museum, both of those buildings. And the archaeology that's been done in the yard spaces around the meeting house have told us a lot about community activities. There was a caterer who operated in the basement of the meeting house and served members of Beacon Hill's community. So there's been an incredible amount of information that's been gathered about how Boston's free Black community was living in Beacon Hill in the 1800s, that until I started doing archaeology, I didn't even realize there was a big Black community historically in Beacon Hill. I thought of Beacon Hill as being primarily, you know, like a Boston Brahmin location. So really incredible information. This is another place that I would definitely encourage you to visit if you have not. Another type of really interesting work that's being done on historic sites is looking at locations of battles. Archaeologists have started using the techniques that have been used for many, many years on Civil War battlefields, where they're using actual military analysis of where people were positioned, where they fired, where gun emplacements were, how people moved across the landscape, to go back in time and to look at sites dating, for example, to King Philip's War, and then also applying that to the Revolutionary War. So the site of Peskeomscut, or Great Falls, which is on the Deerfield River, is a really well-documented engagement between colonists and indigenous people during King Philip's War. Kevin McBride, who is an archaeologist at the University of Connecticut, has done a number of projects with funding from the American Battlefields Protection Program. So the National Park Service is funding this, to use techniques like ground penetrating radar and regular metal detection survey, as well as looking at terrain and landscape and eyewitness accounts from these periods to reconstruct where indigenous and colonial people were moving during King Philip's War, and then doing testing in those locations. And he's finding some really important information about where conflicts happened that's helping to kind of correct the narrative of King Philip's War that is very focused on sort of the colonial perspective on what was going on. At Minuteman National Historic Park, the Battle of, April 19th has always been a part of their interpretation, and there are a number of sites that have been identified from that period. But recently, there's been a number of projects, including at the site that was known as Parker's Revenge. So this was a particular battle that happened on April 19th, 1775. Eyewitness accounts, so we know where it happened. We've done, again, metallic survey, ground penetrating radar to look for changes in the soil, and then with regular gridded metallic survey, some limited excavation, and have been able to identify musket balls and material that, for an archaeologist, it's pretty incredible that we know that that musket ball landed in the ground between these hours on April 19th, 1775. I mean, I'm used to working on an archaeological site where I'm lucky if I can get it within 100 years, right? So the fact that we're able to know that the last time, somebody looked at this musket ball was on this precise day at this precise time is really, really incredible. And it's a really exciting thing to do as an archaeologist. But that being said, there's been very limited excavation here. So it's really just to sort of ground truth what we found. And for the most part, this is a simulation in the bottom right of the movement of both the British regulars and the colonists on that day based on what we're finding archaeologically and matching that up with the historic records. Another sort of tangential part of doing this type of archaeology, this is a project that the city archaeologist is doing in Boston. This is also something you can easily find on their website. During the Battle of Bunker Hill, Charlestown was burned, right? So everybody who lived in Charlestown, their houses were burned and they lost most of their homes and their property. they all filed claims to get money back for the damages that they incurred. So the Boston City archaeologist has gone back through land evidence records and the claims that were filed as part of Revolutionary War reparations to reconstruct every house lot that was in existence in 1776 and to try and identify sort of where people were living and what was happening when that battle was going on. So tangential to the fighting, but a super interesting, cool project. And then they're going back and testing in limited places that they can get to in Charlestown to kind of identify where some of these these losses were documented. And people filled out these very specific inventories. You know, I had 6 Latin spoons and 2 redware pots. And so the thought is that by comparing these things and matching them up with the specific lot, if there's a place where they can go back and test, they're going to be able to identify those locations. So really, really cool stuff. So I mentioned, you know, that 19th century Massachusetts has so many sites from this period. I mentioned the Saugus Iron Works. So that's on the very early end. That was one of the first industrial sites that was built in Massachusetts. Another really, really, really interesting site and unique is this timber dam in Pelham, Massachusetts, that dates to about 1739, may be the oldest or one of the oldest timber construction original dams that was used to generate water power for a mill upstream. This was still in operation 3-4 years ago. And part of the state's mandate right now is to fix dams that are broken or not working, and in many locations to remove those dams so that they can return water flow to its original condition, because 99% of these no longer power anything. So as part of this project, this was a requirement to do archaeological study. So this timber dam was going to be removed. Like, that wasn't an option. So preserving it wasn't an option because it was failing. It was a hazard. It had to be removed. But what ended up happening is that gave the archaeologists a chance to really carefully document the construction of this timber dam. They had to stop the water flow. They took it apart piece by piece. We were able to document the construction and match that up with what were considered to be sort of construction manuals of the day, and see how the individuals who built this dam did or did not follow the techniques that were recommended at the time. They found maker's marks. I thought I had a photo up, but I don't have one up here. They found maker's marks, you know, where different pieces of timber were fitted together. And really, for the fact that this site had to be destroyed, we got an incredible amount of very detailed, both engineering and construction information about what was at one point a very common type of dam before the stone dams that we're used to seeing now was constructed. The boot mill in Lowell, Lowell, Massachusetts was the first planned industrial community in America and set the stage for replication that happened across the country for the rest of time. So a location where the mill, the company store, the housing, everything that goes about the mill happens in one place, and the company controls all of it. Excavations for the National Park Service at the tenement houses where the mill workers lived, and then also at the houses where the superintendents lived, collected information to compare how people were living, how the tenement house workers were living, what they were doing in violation of company rules. For example, at the boot mills, there's all kinds of documentation in the 1800s that alcohol was absolutely strictly forbidden. It was not allowed anywhere on their property. Guess what was found behind the tenement building? Hundreds of bottles of alcohol. There were a lot of Irish immigrants working in these mills. First they were farm girls who came in. They were called the mill girls, who came in, young women who came in from rural communities as farming was starting to not be a pastime. They came in to first work in the mills. There's some of them in that photo. And then gradually they were added to and replaced by primarily Irish immigrants. So the archaeology at the boot mill, again, this is information, this book, Living on the Boot, is a great for information about the archaeology that was done there, but there's also really good interpretive information online and at the Park Service. So getting lots of information about how people were actually living, despite the fact that the company thought they were controlling everything. So archaeology here really filled in a missing piece of sort of the historical record. The Chilmark Brick Works, I only mention this is on Martha's Vineyard because this is an industrial site where we not only documented the workings of how they were making bricks, but also the clay pits that were being mined to bring the raw material in. So one of the things that industrial archaeologists do is they not only look at the manufacturing site, but also the resource area. How were people getting the raw material? So in this case, it's clay pits. There's been a lot of archaeology done at the quarries, the granite quarries in Quincy, to document how stone was being cut, how it was being moved. There was actually a railway that was built to move granite around in and out of the Quincy quarries, partially processed and dressed on site, and then how it was transported away. Milford also has some granite quarries that there's been some archaeology done there. So this is, again, something that the archaeology contributes to understanding sort of the big picture of how industrial sites were operating. And then Roundhouse, this isn't super exciting, but a really well-preserved from the old colony line roundhouse that today has been luckily preserved as an archaeological park. So you can go and see this turntable and pit that were preserved after the site was abandoned. And then this is just a kind of a cool project, in Mansfield, the Bailey Cracker and Mincemeat Factory was operated for a short period of time. And the family that operated this patented a particular kind of cracker baking oven that was all the rage. And if you read sort of industrial history, you know that this was this incredible invention, but nobody really had seen it in operation. We were able, as part of this development project, to excavate partially with machines. So thank you, Roland Robbins, excavate away from the foundations, and our industrial archaeologists, this was a PAL project, our industrial archaeologists were able to actually see how the machinery worked. They were able to take information from the patent filings and see how this cracker, this revolutionary cracker baking rotating oven basically operated in the real world. So a seemingly small site, but really, really important in terms of being able to identify different types of archaeological or different types of technology through archaeology. So communities, not community archaeology, which is something we do with members of the community. These slides are examples of people who are living in communities. And archaeologists look at two types of communities. So we look at voluntary communities where people are gathering together because they want to, and involuntary communities, which include places like prisons and orphanages and asylums and other types of institutions where people, reform schools, where people are being kept mostly against their will, or at least, they're there because of circumstances they don't want to be there. So two extremes here. There's been a lot of work done on some of Massachusetts Shaker communities. There's been more done in New Hampshire. Canterbury Shaker Village has had more archaeology done probably than anywhere else, but documenting at Shaker sites and then also at utopian communities. So Brook Farm in West Roxbury, I think is where it is, was created by the Transcendentalists. Fruitlands is another example of a place where people chose to go to be in community and to live by these certain ideals, live by these very clearly defined written ideals. So doing archaeology at places like that, we're able to see, were people actually doing the things that they said they were going to do? And in most cases, the answer is no, or sort of. And also an important and interesting thing, not so much the Shakers. The Shakers were pretty regimented, but certainly at these utopian communities, the way they wrote about their buildings, how they looked, what they did, it really doesn't match with what you see in the ground. So we're using archaeology to help tell different stories about these places that were somewhat idealized in the historical record. We learn a lot from work that needs to be done at cemeteries, at places where people were confined. So this is an example from Gallops Island, out in Boston Harbor. This is a quarantine cemetery. So out in the Harbor Islands, people were sent there, mostly immigrants in the 1850s, beginning with cholera epidemics and then having some other epidemic diseases afterwards. This site was eroding into the ocean, so some graves were exposed. And this site is managed by the Department of Conservation and Recreation in Massachusetts. So they had archaeologists come in and remove archaeologically a set of graves that were threatened by erosion. So this is a large cemetery. These were removed. When we have to do this type of work, a lot of these individuals, if we're talking about places like orphanages or asylums or poor farms, there's very little information about the individuals who were in those places. So the records that do exist, talk about numbers. Oftentimes there's not even names. People's names aren't listed. And so when we do archaeology at these places, including, when we have to remove a grave, you find items, personal items that people had. At places like a poor farm, for example, you can find little bits of material that show individuals and what they had brought with them that can tell us a little bit about the individual people who were there, where they came from, what things were important to them. The Industrial School for Girls is a site in Dorchester that also the city archaeologist excavated. This was a place that unfortunate girls, I forget there's a term that they use for them, but girls who were from homes that didn't seem to have a lot of future were sent to the industrial school to learn how to be proper young ladies and to learn a skill. So they learned sewing, they learned how to work in a laundry, they learned traditionally, female roles. And they were kept they had very rigorous requirements. The school talked a lot about how they were not allowed to do certain activities at certain times of the day. And throughout the excavations that the city did, they found these small little acts of rebellion. So a student writing on a slate, that was thrown down into a privy. Little dolls. The dolls were given to the children, but they were supposed to be kept in a main area. They weren't supposed to take them out anywhere. And little bits of doll fragments were found in different places on the site. So clearly the girls were taking these dolls where they weren't supposed to take them. So this type of work, archaeology has the potential to bring these stories about the individuals forward. And at the Industrial School for Girls, actually, the UMass Boston Public History program paired up with the archaeology, and the students in one class, they each took one of the girls who attended this school and they researched her and they wrote a biography about her, and they put all of that online and tried to tell a story about each one of the girls who attended the school. It's a really cool thing. You can check that out online if you're interested. Really, really interesting. Okay, I'm running short, so I'm going to go quick. I only have a couple more slides for you. I'm not an underwater archaeologist, but Massachusetts has a board of underwater archaeology. We have a state marine archaeologist who permits and oversees all the work that's done in submerged areas in Massachusetts. For those of you who heard the wonderful talk 2 weeks ago about the Mashunish, the Native American dugout canoes in Lake Quinsigamond, this is one example, an early example of a submerged site. We have the Sparrowhawk, which is a ship that was found in the early part of the late 19th century, partially submerged off Cape Cod, that was imagined or was thought to be interpreted to be one of the small boats that the initial Pilgrim group used to get around to explore Cape Cod. Going back to those days of venerating the Pilgrims, this is on display. I think this is Boston Common, where they've pulled the ship up and they've strengthened its timbers and they put it on display. This went to Pilgrim Hall. It was one of the early displays on Pilgrim Hall. Very recently, been on display there ever since. It's kind of nothing's been done with it. But very recently, archaeologists have done some very specific dendrochronological dating of some of the wood. And you can see here that this study shows they know when the wood was cut, and they actually even know what part of England the wood came from based on the tree species. They also have done a closer examination using some X-ray imaging to look at the fasteners, the metal fasteners that are still present, to help determine exactly based on the style of them. So basically confirming that this is a ship that dates to that period, but I think there's not consensus that this is definitely the Sparrowhawk that the Pilgrims used. It could have been an early exploratory vessel from somebody else who was coming to the shores in that time. The Seaport Schooner, this is a construction site in downtown Boston, buried under 30 feet of fill in what is now the built-out part of Boston Harbor was the remains of this 19th century schooner that had been burned. Basically, the records that we've been able to find about this indicate that the ship caught on fire while it was out at sea. It contained lime and other material that was considered to be explosive. So rather than have a huge explosion once the fire started, the ship was actually intentionally scuttled. So they brought it in, they submerged it, they sunk the ship on purpose, and it was lying in the bottom of the harbor and then got covered over with fill. New construction going deeper than anything that had been there before came down right in the middle of what was, an essentially intact hull of the ship. This was more or less triage emergency archaeology because there had been no requirement to do archaeology here. No one thought there would be anything here. So city archaeologists came in Boston. Tal came in. We did some very, very down and dirty quick documentation, took some of the timbers in storage. They're being conserved now with a boat builder in Maine, I believe. There isn't any money right now to do any additional analysis, but much like, the Sparrowhawk sat around for, 200 years, and we're learning new information. So we're hopefully going to be able to do some study there. And then the last thing I'll mention is the Witta, which is an archaeological site, a shipwreck, a pirate shipwreck off the coast of Chatham that is actively being investigated. I'll say investigated by a group that is a for-profit salvage group who is collecting material from the site to help fund additional work there. This is a typical process when you're a certain distance out from the shoreline. You're able to do this. They are operating under a permit, but over the years there has been some discussion about the ethics of the work that's being done, whether it's being done to sort of proper standards. And in general, when you're doing archaeology, if you're doing it for profit, that's not considered to be actual archaeology. So I leave you with the Witta as it is. It's a very interesting site. They do have a museum with a lot of information on display. Okay. Last slide, if I can get there. Oh, there we go. Oops. So I'll end with just some recent past archaeology, some of the things that people are working on today that are a little bit more recent. One of these is a project in Chinatown that the city archaeology team undertook, trying to get some more information about how the Chinese American population in Chinatown was living in the relatively recent past. This was an empty lot that they were excavating to put a new building in. And so the city archaeology lab came in. There had been a restaurant here, a very popular Chinese restaurant in the 1920s. So they found this is some ware from that. There wasn't a lot of interest in this project, apparently. So the members of the community didn't come out. The people who lived in this area were concerned about the hole being open and rats coming in. Basically, this was sort of a failed effort at public archaeology to engage the community. Everyone said, we're not interested, please fill this back in again. So the archaeologists got some good information, but it wasn't something that sort of served the goal of what they were hoping it would be. More importantly, or more positively, work in Roxbury is being done at the Malcolm X / Little Collins House, which is a place where Malcolm Little, better known as Malcolm X's sister, lived, and where he spent a fair amount of time in the 1940s when he was really active. Apparently, his sister was almost like a mother to him, was very influential in his life. A lot of meetings took place at this house. The house itself dates to the 1850s and was a home of Irish immigrants prior to the Little Collins family coming in. Rodnell Collins, who is pictured here, is Malcolm X's nephew, and he owns the property now and has been very interested in doing archaeology, community-based archaeology with members of the Roxbury community. This is also a project that's been undertaken primarily by the Boston City archaeologists. And so they bring in school children. Rodnell is involved in the processing and the excavation and is able to provide information that his mother shared with him about time in the house. So this is another one of those oral history projects that's connecting the current owner and community members with, the archaeology that's going on at the site. So that's a really great example. And with that, this information and more is going to be coming out in February. We have many more sites that we talked about besides this, so I thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I wanted to. And anyone who needs to leave, please do, but I'm happy to stay and answer any questions that I can for those who would like. Thank you. Can you stop the recording now? Okay. I'll leave my slides up, but stop recording. Stop recording to thought, yes.